What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So patch 7.2 dropped last week with the changes to jungle and as well of course the way to how lethality works. But as far as champions go, there weren't actually that many tweaks outside of the Warwick rework, a couple minor changes here and there, which does mean that there's still quite a lot of champions that are maybe feeling a little bit underpowered right now. And fans of those champions have been waiting a pretty long time to hear some good news. Fortunately though, we've gathered some info and some Rioter comments on some of these underpowered picks and have a pretty good idea about which champions in the future are likely or almost certainly going to be getting buffed sometime within the next few patches. So today we're taking a look at all of the champions that we could find that are definitely going to be receiving buffs in the future and what those buffs might actually be. And as well, I wanted to give a huge shout out to ProGuides.com for helping out with the editing on this video. They're a really great place to go to for those of you guys trying to improve your game, but you guys don't have to take it from me. They've got a free trial so you can check it out and really just decide for yourself if you like it or not. So let's get started. So first on our list is a name that doesn't actually come up that often in the patch notes, and it's Chogath. So Chogath's last buff was actually way back in patch 6.6, but with Riot handing him more bonus health for every feast stack. However, Riot have been putting a lot of time into fixing up the sort of buggy cone-shaped spells in the game, and Chogath was a major abuser of those issues. The problem was whenever he activated his Feral Scream, anyone in the cone would take damage and get silenced from the ability even if they had dashed or flashed away from it before the animation actually finished. And that was obviously going to be actually kind of a pretty big hidden nerf to Chogath, who was already pretty weak even with the bug helping him out quite a lot. So they decided to put more range into the ability and give it a lower cooldown to compensate. And to round off these changes that landed in patch 620, they reduced his silence duration and called it a day. And the goal of the changes was never to make Chogath bad, but overall it was definitely a nerf, and it did end up dropping Chogath down to a pretty low win rate of 45%, which is where he's kind of been stuck ever since. And Riot Meddler has come out and confirmed that there are definitely buffs in the works to help Chogath out, but he did mention that they were pretty experimental at the time, and he didn't necessarily offer any specifics. The aim is going to be, of course, to put him back to where he was around before the Feral Scream mechanics change, so hopefully whatever Riot decides to push out for Chogath is going to give him a much needed win rate increase, because he's been actually in quite a weak spot for quite a few patches now. And we do have a little bit of a rough idea from what these changes might look like from the PBE updates, but the changes were recently actually reverted on the PBE, with Riot Manwolf saying that they weren't actually ready yet for patch 7.3, which means that we'll likely see these Chogath buffs in patch 7.4 instead. Next up, we have Vladimir, who's another champion that's actually been really struggling since the last few patches of Season 6. He's been in a pretty similar state to Chogath with just a pretty awful win rate of around maybe 43 to 46% or so, but Riot definitely wants to fix that this patch by hopefully giving him a few buffs to his laning phase. The first change they're making is a buff to +3 of his base attack damage, which doesn't actually sound like an awful lot, but it is actually a lot more than you might first think when it comes to, CSing in the early game. For example, Vayne earlier way back in the day was nerfed by 3 base AD, and at the time it did actually turn out to be reasonably effective. But that's not it though. Riot are also going to be increasing Vladimir's missile speed to make his auto attacks a lot smoother, and also putting some more power into transfusion by upping the ability power ratio and base damage too. And to compensate for that change though, they will be shaving power away from the Crimson Rush's bonus damage effect, but it should still give Vladimir a stronger laning phase overall, which is kind of meant to be his forte, and overall it's definitely a buff for sure. On paper, Vladimir is potentially one of the weakest champions in the game right now, so giving him a bit more power in the early game is definitely going to be a nice fix for him, since it should better prepare him for the rest of the game and mean that he doesn't fall too far behind in the first 10 minutes or so due to being a little bit weak early on. Riot have always had a little bit of difficulty balancing lifesteal or spell vamp focused champions, and things with Vladimir got a bit messy after his rework, but the biggest change to his power was actually as a result of the nerf to Rylai's Crystal Scepter, and the changes to Grievous Wounds items as well that made his heal-oriented build just way less effective in general. Assuming everything goes fine on the PBE and Riot are happy with the tweaks, it's likely that we'll see the Vladimir buffs arrive on patch 7.3. Talon as well is another champion that's currently on Riot's radar, as they recently announced in their State of the Champion update post, and they mentioned that although they were really happy with the design of Talon's rework, he did feel actually a little bit weak at launch. The biggest issue with Talon right now is that his must-buy items are definitely on, the weaker side of things. So hopefully Riot will be looking at buffing those and hoping it's going to help him out. And they also mentioned that they will be pushing some small direct buffs for Talon forward as well. Talon's actually been doing kind of okay though overall, I guess, through patch 7.1 and 7.2. So as an assassin, Riot will definitely have to be careful not to overbuff him to the point where he just ends up getting played in every single game. He's currently not played very often, definitely not enough to get a real idea of where his true win rate lies, but he does seem to be getting a little bit closer to the ideal point, and hopefully he can make it there with these upcoming buffs. Now the next few champions we're going to be covering in this video aren't necessarily as guaranteed to be getting buffs, as for the following champions there haven't been an exact confirmation, but they are still extremely likely, I want to say like 90-95% likely to receive buffs, since all of these champions do have some sort of rider comments and they're all in bad places right now. So the first two champions are both 80 carries. We've got Tristana and Lucian. So the issue with Tristana is that she's been in actually quite a big slump ever since the start of Season 6. In fact, she didn't actually get a single direct buff or nerf during the entire season, which did come after a lot of pro teams found a ton of success with her in the Season 5 World Championships. So it was pretty surprising to see her get kinda nerfed and then abandoned by Riot for such a long time. In fact, she actually hasn't had a positive win rate since 2015, and only pro teams that can abuse her super long range in a Protect the Tristana composition have had any success with her. It seems like Riot are finally going to address her weakness and give her a couple buffs that could arrive in patch 7.3, or more likely I want to say patch 7.4 depending on what they do. They're likely going to give her a bit more attack speed per level and potentially lower the cooldown on her Q as well, but they're probably playing it really safe because there's not a whole lot of ways to balance Tristana without risking over buffing her. The biggest issue with Tristana is that her huge range is definitely a pretty big advantage over other 80 carry champions, so if they do end up making her stronger, they really do have to keep in mind to make sure that she doesn't just become, an absolute god after the 20-30 minute mark where she can two-shot everyone in the game with a few items without having to be in range for anyone. Overall though, it should be a nice couple of tweaks to Tristana though, and it should work out pretty well for sure. Next up, we've got Lucian, of course, who's also had periods of being just a god tier pick, but actually has been struggling for quite some time now. 80 carries in general recently have definitely been having a pretty hard time, but Lucian was also hit pretty hard by the changes to some of his core items that were originally intended for assassins actually, not marksman champions. That being said though, Riot doesn't expect Lucian players to stop picking up the lethality items, so they are kind of being a little bit hesitant with buffs for him until players have had plenty of time to test him out after the changes to the lethality items that we saw in patch 7.2. Riot Meddler also commented that there's a lot of potential for those lethality changes to have a very big impact on Lucian, so they definitely need to see how those tweaks play out for him before handing him direct buffs and potentially just overbuffing him into like a monster state, which means that it's very unlikely we'll see buffs to Lucian in patch 7.3, but depending on the power of new lethality Lucian buffs, we could definitely see some minor increases to his power on patch 7.4 or maybe on patch 7.5. Lucian's definitely one of the more exciting marksman champions to watch. He's got a really fluid kit and he's just really awesome to play. So it's pretty likely that Riot won't want to leave him in the gutter for too long. After all, Lucian's been a really popular champion throughout time. Having said that, like Tristana, Lucian's kit does give him a pretty decent advantage over other conventional 80 carries, so any buffs are likely to be very small and very calculated changes to avoid him potentially, completely dominating the meta once again. And that same logic with Lucian can also of course be applied to our next champion for today, which is actually Zed. He's had a much more turbulent win rate history than other champions on our list today for sure, although he's currently not doing so hot in the meta right now. As with Lucian, he's likely to be affected pretty heavily by the changes to lethality, but according to Riot Ghostcrawler, Zed was apparently lined up to actually get some buffs on patch 7.3 as well. Considering the changes to Duskblade and Edge of Night are both likely to make Zed a lot stronger, that could potentially make it a pretty bad time to hand Zed some other buffs, because it could, potentially overtune him, maybe overbuff him, and make him a really strong pick again until he's eventually nerfed. Zed's kit is in a much healthier place overall since his rework, I think, but Riot do definitely need to be a little bit careful tuning him to get him into like a really good state, a perfect state of balance of being impactful without being, totally dominant. It could be that the lethality item changes are actually enough to do this by themselves, but if that doesn't end up being the case, then Riot do have a few small buffs prepared in mind in the back of their heads that they could push on patch 7.3 or 7.4 for Zed. In terms of specifics, Riot Meddler mentioned that they were looking at bigger grace periods for his Shadow Reaping passive, and a slightly longer W duration to give him more mid-fight options. But he did also mention that these were experimental changes, so I can't say for sure if they are the likely form of a potential buff that would be coming to Zed if they do decide to buff him. Either way though, that's just about going to wrap things up on the champions that we know that are going to be getting buffed by Riot in the upcoming future next few patches, hopefully. Hopefully it's reassuring to those of you guys who like playing those champions, or maybe you wanted to pick up and start playing one of these champions. You can do that with a good sense of mind and the fact that they are going to get buffed in the future so that, your champion is future proof almost, if that makes sense. Either way though, definitely let us know in the comments section below what you think about some of the upcoming buffs, the balance changes to these champions, or maybe suggest some of your own champions that you think deserve some buffs in the future. Either way though, looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.